Welcome to Environmental Sustainability. So today we're going to talk about human population. So as we move forward now, we're starting to get more into how humans are affecting the environment. While we talked about the ecosystems and ecology and the environment before, now we're talking about, okay, what have the humans done? What have we done to really influence the ecosystems, and what can we do moving forward to make sure that it's somewhat sustainable? So ecosystems are a vital part to human populations. That's why we always hear about these debates about what should we do for the environment, how are we going to help the environment, how are we going to make sure that it's sustainable. So all ecosystems have energy flow, which we have talked about, and the cycle of matter, which we've also talked about with our carbon cycles and our nitrogen cycle and sulfur cycle. The terrestrial areas, you have the forest, the woodlands, grasslands, savannas, croplands, wetlands, deserts, and tundra. And then we have the oceanic systems, which involve the coastal ocean and bays, coral reefs, as well as open oceans. And the ecosystems provide a number of services that we give names to. So you have provisioning services, which are natural goods, wood, food, fuel, materials, which our economy and well-being depend on. So this is the provisioning services really influence the economy. You have regulating services, which are going to benefit regulations of ecosystem processes, flood control, climate moderation. You have cultural services that are non-material benefits that we typically don't think of when we're talking about the resources that the ecosystem is going to provide, but it's spiritual enrichment, it's knowledge, it's aesthetics. So all of these things are going to have an influence on our cultural aspect of our lives. And then you have supporting services which are going to maintain themselves, such as photosynthesis. Now, all ecosystems provide some or all of these services, whether we notice them or take note of them or not. Ecosystems provide natural goods and services worth an estimated 41 trillion each year, and that's all for free. So we don't really talk about this much, but without these ecosystems, right, we would be missing out on 41 trillion free dollars. But ultimately, as time goes on, that number is going to decrease if we don't turn things around. Ecosystems and species worldwide are declining, which is the reason we have to take efforts to preserve the habitats. You see that when we compare terrestrial ecosystems versus ocean ecosystems, that forests make up a major part of the terrestrial ecosystems that are very productive. But um, when we look at open oceans, which are going to dominate our ocean ecosystems, they are not very productive. What are much more productive are our coastal ocean bays, and which make up about 5%. And a very important piece of the ocean are coral reefs, because they contain a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different organisms. So they are a lot more productive. But we see that in the ocean, that doesn't really take up. It's only about 5% of that, and then you have this 95% open ocean that is not very productive. So when we see the terrestrial side is much more productive with our forests and our grasslands. But when we look over here, all right, 95% of it is low productivity open ocean area. A natural area is only protected when society values its services higher than the value assigned to the direct human use of the resource. So we need to agree that, hey, let's not bleed this area dry and take all of the resources from it, because it's more important to us leaving it as is. Now, as time goes on, we see a shift where people are more worried about the areas than they are about the resources that we can pull from that area. But in the past, we've just kind of bled these ecosystems dry. So natural resources are natural ecosystems, and their organisms are expected to produce something of value. The most commonly understood value is economic value. So we're always worried about money. We're always talking about money. That's very tangible to us, really to everyone, because whether you think that money is important or not, we can all feel it. We know what money is about, and we can place some kind of importance to it. I think most people would agree that money's very important for them. Yeah, okay, a lot of people say it doesn't buy happiness, but it is a necessary evil. We do need money in order to survive in our current society. So referring to natural systems as resources actually makes it easy to lose sight of their value beyond just economics. So now the big push is really to refer to it as ecosystem capital, because that kind of brings back the value of, hey, this is coming from an ecosystem, and yeah, we can call them resources, but really it is capital that we're gaining from by bleeding ecosystems dry. So the big push now is to no longer call them just resources, because resources sounds like, hey, we just pulled them from out of nowhere and it's not really affecting anything, where ecosystem capital has a better sound that really paints a different picture for you. Markets are able to assess the economic value of the provisioning services of the ecosystem, such as the wood or the timber, the fish, and the crops. But it is much harder to put a price tag on the regulating and the supportive services and the cultural services. So, as much as we would love people to be more involved with the ecosystems and going there to hike and to do yoga and Pilates and meditate, you're not going to get as many people behind that as the amount of people that are going to see these provisioning services and wonder what we can do about the amount of timber, fish, and crops that we can get from those ecosystems. So an example is that cutting forests gives immediate economic benefit, but has a long-term loss in regulating and supporting services. So you need people to kind of pick up on that in order to see a change. Ecosystems are only maintained when they provide economic value. Otherwise, they would be developed on. So if they have some kind of resource that we want to keep up there, then we're going to maintain them. Otherwise, we're going to chop everything down and we're going to build houses or commercial buildings there. So it depends on the area and it depends on how people see that area, what makes us decide if we're going to kind of leave it alone and try to sustainably extract resources from it, or if we're just going to wipe it out and create developments and homes there. The ability of an ecosystem and its biota and its living things to regenerate makes it a renewable resource. Ecosystems can replenish themselves. They are sustainable. They can go on indefinitely if we take care of them and we extract resource from them the right way. We can use resources, but trouble happens when we take more than can be replaced, and that's what we often do, and that's why we're trying to shift that as we move forward into the future. Conservation of biota and ecosystems manages or regulates use. So we need to make sure that we're regulating these things in order to conserve these ecosystems. Environmentalists establish goals to make sure that the system sustains itself. But that's why we need scientists and environmental scientists or environmentalists to keep an eye on things and research and understand what steps can we use to move forward and what's the best way of going about it. So you have this term consumptive use. People harvest natural resources for food, shelter, tools, fuel, and clothing. Resources are used for people's own needs, not shown in a nation's calculated market economy, but it does play a major role in the economy. Productive use is the term used for the exploitation of ecosystem resources for economic gain. So this is all about economic gain. And the products are harvested and sold, and an important source of revenue and jobs for whatever economy that you're talking about. Sorry. There's 4 types of property rights to consider. So they always say that possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, same goes for environmental science. So the rights of tenure, or the property rights over land and water, allow consumptive or productive resource use depending on who owns it and who is maintaining it. So you have private ownership, which restricts access to natural resources; commercial ownership, which permits use of natural resources by members of the community. You have state ownership, which implies regulated use by the state, so the state is going to control. And then you have open access resources can be used by anyone. Each has the potential for abuse. So if the state is not properly regulating these areas or these resources, then we're going to see that they can be abused. Same thing goes for private ownership and open access and commercial ownership. When we talk about maximum sustainable yield, the central question is managing a renewable resource. All right, how much use can be sustained without undercutting the resource's ability to renew itself? So it gets to a point where, yeah, we might have some left, but it's not going to be able to renew itself. So we want to find that range or that area where it is still sustainable. So you have we usually abbreviate it to MSY. It's the highest rate of use the system can match with its own rate of replacement or maintenance. We're constantly looking for this MSY in order to make sure that it's sustainable. So it applies to the harvesting of biota, fish, forests, etc. We see this big in the fishing industry or the fisheries, as well as air quality, water quality, and soils. MSY is just before the point at which use begins to destroy the system's regenerative capacity. So we try to cut it as close as possible. We talked about carrying capacity. It's the maximum population the ecosystem can sustainably support. In a population approaching carrying capacity, competition between individuals will reduce survival of new individuals. So you have maximum sustainable yield occurs at that halfway to the carrying capacity. All right, so we're constantly trying to maintain an area where, yeah, the carrying capacity might be up here where we see this, where it's teetering along this imaginary line, but we're constantly cutting it back and we're decreasing the amount of organisms, and we want to keep it at that MSY area, and that is going to be halfway to that carrying capacity point. Now, we don't know what the carrying capacity is oftentimes. That's why we have to research it and dig deeper in order to understand what's the carrying capacity and what is our MSY for this particular resource. We see that there's this constant fight between recruitment and population size. So you want the optimal population size for harvesting to make sure that it's sustainable. And we're constantly teetering between, all right, the yield is reduced by competition or the yield is reduced by decreased population. We want it somewhere in between where it is sustainable. The optimum population for harvesting the MSY is halfway to the carrying capacity, like I said. Achieving the MSY is complicated. You have carrying capacity may be unknown or may vary. Replacement of harvested individuals varies. Humans adversely affect habitats from one year to the next. Reproductive rates, carrying capacity, sustainability, yields, and more, depending on what humans are doing at any given year or any given decade, that in which it's going to all have different effects on the year-to-year reproductive rates and habitats and the sustainability yields. MSY is used to set a fixed quota. In fisheries, it's the total allowable catch. So we're always hearing about fishermen have a certain amount that they are allowed. They obviously want to be able to catch as much as possible because it's all about money. They have to feed their families. But we want it to be sustainable. We want to make sure that we don't reach a detrimental point. Inaccurate data overestimates the total allowable catch. Users and politicians want to keep the harvest high for the economic gain. With uncertainties, overuse, and resource depletion, managers use the precautionary principle. Where there is uncertainty, managers must favor resource protection. All right, so we want managers to favor this resource protection. Does it always happen? Not necessarily, but the hope is that their push is for long-term effects in the ecosystem. We're hoping that they see that, hey, long-term, this is best for the resource, best for the fishing industry, even though maybe that year, they're more concerned about the current time and making money for the fishermen. Exploitation limits are set well below the MSY. Conflicts arise between users and managers, obviously, because it goes back to money. There are principles and public policies to protect natural resources. Do not treat resources as open access commons where you can just take as much as you want and do whatever you want to that resource. Use scientific research. Okay, so it's all research-based. To assess health and set limits, use the precautionary principle to set limits on use, which is that, hey, if we aren't sure that it is going to be sustainable, we have to make sure that we're well below that and make sure that it is sustainable. Enforce regulations and protect it from poaching. Eliminate economic incentives that encourage violation of the regulations. And we see many times, hey, just the economic gain alone is going to encourage that, let alone if there's some other economic incentive that's going to encourage that. Remove subsidies that encourage exploitation and involve all stakeholders. Okay, that's people of the community as well as the fishermen and the companies that are involved with the fishermen and everything else under the sun. Involve all of them in the decision making to make sure that all parties are as happy as can be. So we have ecosystems are under pressure. Human domination of the landscape is pervasive. Even where systems seem natural, fire suppression, killing animals, controlling rivers, introducing exotics, harvesting wood, half of the land is now for grazing and crops. So we see that now, as we move forward, in order to keep the human population at what it is, we need to get rid of a lot of these ecosystems so that we can plant crops. Forests provide goods such as lumber, paper, fibers, gums, even latex, fruits, berries, nuts, fuel, medicine, and even more. So they provide an estimated 54 million jobs worldwide. They conserve biodiversity, prevent erosion, moderate flooding, and store nutrients. So deforestation is a big one that we always talk about, all right, getting rid of the trees, wiping out the trees, killing that forest ecosystem. Natural forests are not easily exploited for food, so humans convert them to agricultural use so that we can plant crops. Deforestation, which is the removal of forests and replacement by another use, continues globally. So this is happening all over the world. It's not just something that those terrible Americans are doing. All right, it's happening all over the world. Over 200 million acres have been degraded since 2000. So even since the year 2000, at that point we have known that deforestation was bad, and we're still continuing to see that over 200 million acres have been degraded since. 33% is due to production of beef, soybeans, palm oil, and wood products, which we need these things. So you see, that's why we continue it, because we want the human population to sustain itself. We want people to not starve and die off. The short-term gains in crop yields, food production, and profit tend to not last. So you have consequences of deforestation: reduced productivity, nutrients, biomass, drier, eroded soil, changed hydrologic cycle, which is the water cycle. Water drains off the land instead of being released through transpiration and infiltrating into the ground. You have desertification, which is the spread of deserts. Okay, it's not sustainable to keep that land as crops, and ultimately all of the nutrients are going to be sucked from that land, and then they're going to become more of like a desert ecosystem. There's less CO2 is removed from the air as well. Biodiversity is greatly reduced, and then you have an increased stress, which is going to lead to pests, disease, and fires. Grassland ecosystems, the most overexploited ecosystems on Earth. You have the temperate areas, prairies, veldt, steppe, and tampas. And you have the tropics, which are the savannas, have with scattered trees, have moderate rainfall, well-developed soils, often converted to grain crops and livestock grazing. So you see in these areas that they are going to convert these savannas and these prairies into grain crops and livestock grazing. Conversion has had negative effects: decreased antelope, elk, bison, grassland birds, increased erosion. So if you don't have these plants there to keep the soil solid, then there's going to be a lot of weathering and erosion and salinization, less carbon storage and groundwater recharge, and you have desertification. Oceans cover 75% of the Earth's surface. Humans have severely impacted the oceans because of foods, mainly transportation, as well as shipping and recreation. So We need to start to value our oceans as we move forward. You have marine fisheries provide 200 million jobs, so that's that economic portion that we talked about, account for 15% of human protein consumption. So 15% of all protein that humans consume is coming from these marine fisheries. Oceans are a major part of Earth's regulation of energy movement and nutrient cycling. 70 to 80% of oxygen comes from marine algae. Overfishing has changed ocean food webs because large fish are removed first, which leaves behind smaller, faster reproducing fish. Fishers overfish top predators like the larger fish like tuna, marlin, and swordfish until they are forced to move down the food chain and they continue to break the links in the food web. Coastal zones are protect land from storms, tides, and erosion. A lot of food is produced in coastal zones, but humans have managed to degrade and destroy them. Half of the world's 45 million acres of mangrove forests, which are these in between areas where there's this brackish water that we call brackish. It's partially salty, partially fresh, have been cut. So you have mangrove forests are just destroyed in order to plant rice and for fuel, logging, shrimp, and wood, but conversion to shrimp farms has slowed because they are prone to diseases. So then they are abandoned. So you're getting rid of these mangrove forests, and ultimately, whatever you put there is not sustainable. As the nations recognize the value of mangroves, pressure to stop destructing them is increases. So now we're seeing how important mangrove forests are, and we're trying to leave them alone, but a lot of the damage is already done. Coral reefs, like I said, very productive. There's a lot of biodiversity there. They occur in shallow coastal waters. One of the most diverse and productive ecosystems. Coral reefs contain zooxanthellae, which are photosynthetic algae that creates a symbiotic relationship with coral. So coral is not just a stone, it's actually this algae symbiotic mutualistic relationship, and coral provide a home for the zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae are going to provide food for the coral. So that's that mutualistic relationship. An estimated 20% of the world's coral has been destroyed already. You have ocean acidification because of humans. It's a result of rising atmospheric CO2. As CO2 enters the ocean and increases the number of hydrogen ions, acidic waters decrease the carbonate ions, which makes it harder for them to build their skeletons. Rising temperatures also have a negative effect on coral reefs. So we have increased CO2, increased temperatures. Both of them go hand in hand. It's going to create this acidity in the ocean, or the ocean acidification, and it's going to lead to coral bleaching, which because of the increased water temperatures leads to the removal of these zooxanthellae from the coral, which causes them to die, and it results in the coral turning a white color, which is why they call it coral bleaching. All right, this shows you bleached coral. Ocean pollution. The oceans receive human waste, plastic, oil, and sediment from farms. Nutrient runoff from farms is depleting oxygen because these dead zones cannot support life, such as the algae that creates the oxygen. Plastics are destroying ocean food webs. We have huge areas in the ocean that has tons and tons of plastics, and it's really having a detrimental effect on the food webs. Climate change is warming water, changing currents, melting ice, causing sea levels to rise, and animals to change their range. It's a general change in the climate, not just warmer temperatures, but warmer waters and more drastic weather and more drastic changes or ranges in the climate. You have microplastics now. Oceans are filled with plastic pollution that form giant garbage patches in the oceans. If you go off of the Pacific Ocean, off of California, they have these huge garbage patches that are miles long. And ultimately, we're going to have in there small plastic pieces, ones that are smaller than 5 millimeters. We call those microplastics. And microplastics are going to be consumed by fish. Fish don't really know if is that a smaller organism that I'm supposed to eat, or is that a plastic? It might look like something it's supposed to eat to them, and it's really not. It ends up in their tissue actually, And then when these fish are consumed by other organisms, the microplastic begins to make their way throughout the food chain. And eventually it can make its way back to us. So we're actually eating microplastics because of all the plastic that we have in the ocean. So it's not like it just floats out in the ocean and it's just sitting around there and it's an eyesore. Not just an eyesore, it's actually going to end up making its way into the tissues of the food web, of the organisms in the food web. And then, when the fishermen go out and they collect these things, can make its way back to us, and then we're eating microplastics. Are you going to see it? No, these things can be microscopic particles of plastic, but hey, we're eating it, and that can't be good for us. The 20th century life circumstances give people different health concerns, access to education, medical care, and so on. They have different family sizes and resource use. Americans don't realize the way that most of the people in the world live. So we see that we live a better life, even though a better life to us maybe, but we're creating more pollution, and ultimately we don't really see things the way that other people see things. So we wanted to have this big push to change things and decrease pollution and our consumption and all these things, but people in other places of the world, they're just trying to make do with what they have, and maybe they're not able to decrease their consumption of things. We have a big push where we don't want to use as many plastic bottles. Well, maybe that's all that they have in order to use, so they have to drink out of plastic bottles, where we're going to just order some metal container off of Amazon and move forward. So in the 20th century, human population actually tripled. The rate has slowed in recent years, but it is still ever growing. Technology has led to improved well-being, but extreme poverty is still widespread in the world. Not so much in America, so we don't really see it. Out of sight, out of mind, I guess, but it is widespread throughout the world. So we see that we started to have this exponential growth around 1830. So this shows you a huge decrease. We lost about a third of the human population because of the Black Plague. And then around 1830, we start to have this huge boom, and now we are approaching 8 billion. Okay, and they say eventually by 2100 we might be at this 10.9 billion if it is sustainable. So revolutions have changed our lives throughout history. You have the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, environmental revolution have changed the way that we interact with our environment. We have the Neolithic revolution about 12,000 years ago, which involved animal husbandry, which is keeping livestock, and agriculture produced abundant food. So, when we were hunter-gatherers, well, then, we didn't really keep livestock, but then as we became, smarter, and we kept a tribe, we then kept livestock and started to plant agriculture, and we kind of hunkered down. So results in settlements and specialization of labor. We're no longer just hunter-gatherers. Technology produced tools, trade, and food shortage. Food storage. So decreased mortality and increased food, which enabled population growth over time, eventually. Industrial revolution in the 17th and 18th century of modern science and technology driven by the use of fossil fuels. So this is where fossil fuels really came in and really changed the world as we know it. Let people do much more work. It led to more food and further population growth. Also led to economic growth as well as pollution. So back then we weren't so worried about it, but now we see, hey, we have become totally dependent on these fossil fuels, and this pollution cycle continues. You have the medical revolution in the 19th century, which was big in keeping people alive. Medical breakthroughs decreased deaths from diseases, smallpox, diphtheria, measles, scarlet fever. These were major things that people had to worry about once upon a time, and now we kind of take it for granted because now we don't see that as much, but typically hit infants and children the hardest. A lot of infants and children died of these diseases. Stopped possible epidemics. Detrimental outbreaks were the Black Plague could have taken place, so we could have seen smallpox take over the globe if it wasn't for modern medicine in the 19th century. Scientists established that many diseases were caused by infectious agents. So just realizing that diseases weren't, from sinning or from something you did wrong, or whatever it may be. It wasn't just your fate to have that. It wasn't God striking you dead. It actually came from infectious agents such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Technology decreased child and infant mortality with breakthroughs such as vaccinations, which was a major one, even though now we see people take it for granted. And now people are arguing that we shouldn't be vaccinated. These actually have, and they do more good than bad. Cities and towns treating sewage and drinking water was huge. Now you have drinking an infinite supply of drinking water, or so it seemed, and you're keeping our waste elsewhere. We're not living amongst our sewage and our waste. Penicillin, which was the first antibiotic that cured many diseases such as pneumonia. Eventually we see that it no longer works because of the bacteria started to evolve and change. But that was the first one major breakthrough in modern medicine. And then you have nutritional improvements as well, which we're still making. The Green Revolution, concerns over producing food for the larger population led to increased agricultural efficiency. Pesticides, irrigation, and fertilizer increased yields of crops. Artificial selection creates crops with more desirable traits. Okay, so maybe before there were crops that were hard to eat or hard to manufacture or make edible, and we were actually able to artificially select which traits were more desirable and turn that crop into a better crop for us to consume. Industrialized agriculture has significant costs. Soil and water are used faster than they are replaced, so that's a major issue. Erosion, soil pollution, water pollution, loss of native plants, and biodiversity. When you go in and you cut down all the trees and you kind of change that whole ecosystem, now suddenly you're going to also see that there's going to be a loss of native plants, and you're going to have a decrease in biodiversity, and that's also going to lead to erosion, soil pollution, and water pollution. Pesticide resistance, these target organisms are no longer affected by pesticides. So just like with antibiotics, where we see over time the bacteria start to evolve and they are no longer they now start to resist those antibiotics. They're no longer affected by the antibiotics. The same thing goes for insects that are constantly sprayed with pesticides. Over time, the ones that have the traits that are resistant to the pesticides are going to live longer. They're going to pass on those traits, and now all you're going to be left with are the ones that were able to survive, and they were the ones that were able to pass on those traits, and they pass on those traits to the next generation, and now all of the next generation are resistant to that, and then we have to come out with stronger and better pesticides that we're not sure if we should be spraying onto our food and our crops. So genetically modified organisms, hominids have been using artificial selection. All right, humanoids have been using artificial selection, also known as selective breeding, for millennia. We were breeding wolves into domestic dogs for a long time. Even to this day, we continue to breed these dogs to have certain traits. If you think about like a pit bull, all right, people want to fight pit bulls. Well, they're going to constantly breed them. They're going to take the biggest mother and the biggest father from their litters, and then they're going to breed them, and then from those litters they're going to take the biggest female and the biggest male, and they're going to breed them, and then over time they make this fighting pit bull that is stronger than any other dog. But we also did that with crops. So Homo sapiens bred this crop called teosinte, which is actually very hard to eat, into maize or corn over thousands of years. So over thousands of years, as we constantly picked for a softer kernel and a better tasting teosinte, it eventually became corn, a completely different crop. So ultimately, these organisms were modified genetically. We genetically modified them, not the way you might think of where scientists are in a lab and they're changing the genes, but we did change the genes by picking the genes we want and weeding out the genes we didn't want. So artificial selection turned actually the wild mustard plant, which is this, turned this plant, which doesn't look like something you really want to eat probably, into many other plants, right? By selecting for maybe ones that have this look to it, all right? The broccoli, all right, we wanted the heads of broccoli. Well, over time, we constantly were selecting for anything that had kind of like a head to it. And then now we see the whole thing as a head. Cauliflower, we wanted something that also had that head to it. Cabbage, we wanted something that was very leafy. Well, we kept selecting for the ones that had these leaves, more and more of these leaves, and over time we created this cabbage. And the same goes for Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi and kale. Inserting DNA into bacterial genomes to have bacteria make specific proteins, known as genetic engineering. This changed a lot of things, specifically when we talk about diabetics. Now, instead of having to harvest insulin from pigs or cows and have humans use that insulin, now we can have bacteria. We can insert the gene, the human gene, for creating insulin, and we can insert into a bacteria. Now the bacteria knows how to create that protein, create that insulin, and now that's how we get human insulin for diabetics. We don't have to harvest it from humans or other animals or anything like that. We actually have bacteria make it for us. So we use this genetic engineering in order to make insulin, human growth hormone, and they're exactly the same as they are when a human makes it themselves. So since a diabetic can't make it themselves, now we're going to see that we're going to harvest it from this bacteria. And we have continued to use this principle as we move forward for more and more answers. Genetically modified organisms, by 1994, food was genetically modified, and we first came up with a tomato called the Flavor Saver tomato. It hit grocery stores, and it was created to be more resistant to rotting. This tomato paved the way for other genetically engineered foods. So we don't hear about it too often because people didn't really like it. It didn't really taste very good, and no one really saw the need for this Flavor Saver tomato. But it did show some promise as to what we could do with it in the future. So in 1995, the BT tomato was cultivated, which then led to the BT cotton and then BT maize or corn. And BT crops, so all these BT potato, BT cotton, and BT maize, were create their own pesticides to ward off insects. So now you have these foods that, or these crops that are resistant themselves to insects, which is great for us. Now, you do have some issues with weeds and other plants trying to make their way into the soil. So they came up with glyphosate tolerant soybeans, which glyphosate is, or glyphosate is Roundup. Okay, Monsanto created this herbicide called Roundup, and in order to spray everything with this stuff, you need to have a crop that is not going to be affected by this chemical. And so they came up with this glyphosate tolerant soybeans, and now the soybeans can be sprayed with Roundup and they're not going to die, but everything around it, that all the weeds and the other plants that are trying to decrease the yield of the soybeans are then going to be killed off. So that is another example of us genetically modifying organisms. By 2000, a major breakthrough was this stuff called golden rice, which has really saved populations. It was created, which it increased the nutrient value of the crop of rice. First genetically modified crop to do so. Okay, golden rice greatly decreases vitamin A deficiency in areas with shortages. So now, if you feed people this golden rice, now they're not going to die of vitamin A deficiency. So we don't have to worry about that so much. But in other countries, underdeveloped countries, they have an issue with consuming enough vitamin A. And now, instead of them growing regular rice, you can have them grow this golden rice, and they're not going to have the vitamin A deficiency. So this just gives you an idea of, vitamin A deficiencies prior to 2000. So prior to 2000, we see that there are a lot of countries where there's a decrease in the amount of vitamin A. So these are moderate right here. These beige and orange is moderate vitamin A deficiencies. But then you look at these red areas, and these are very deficient in vitamin A. So you go to Africa, you go to India, and you plant golden rice instead of other types of rice, and now the population can eat the golden rice instead, which is great because a lot of these populations lived off rice anyway. You plant the golden rice and they can harvest the golden rice, and now they are no longer vitamin A deficient, and children aren't dying and going blind of vitamin A deficiency.